Chapter 33. On March 7, 2000, Gratton was brought before the Honorable Maxine Chesney in the Northern District Court of California, San Francisco, for sentencing. Both sides had made their case. Nevertheless, regardless of opinion, all evidence for and against Gratton was reviewed, and a downward departure for his cooperation was expected. A few factors leaning in Gratton's favor were taken from a brief written by his lawyer, which read, "Since pleading guilty, Mr. Gratton has scrupulously abided by the terms of his cooperation agreement, meeting with agents and prosecutors on numerous occasions, providing them with a wealth of information. During these debriefings, Mr. Gratton provided the government with a typewritten list containing 350 names of individuals active or associated with the Nuestra Familia, Nuestra Raza, or local Norteño street gangs. Furthermore, as a result of Mr. Gratton's post-plea debriefings totaling several hundred pages, Gratton also provided the government with diagrams and flowcharts of NF's hierarchy and structure, transcriptions of NS constitutions and bylaws and NR's chain of command, and a history of Hispanic prison gangs in Northern California. Moreover, of far greater significance than the paper it has generated, Mr. Gratton's cooperation has potentially saved lives. By alerting the government as to those individuals who have fallen into disfavor with the NF's leadership, Mr. Gratton has enabled law enforcement to get in touch with those individuals and to notify them of their present danger. In addition, as part of his continuing cooperation in this matter, Mr. Gratton has also provided local law enforcement with information on numerous and in many cases unsolved shootings, murders, arsons, narcotics dealings activities, and other gang-related crimes. In each of these instances, Mr. Gratton has offered to testify in court should the government wish him to do so. With this in mind, and because of Gratton's enormous assistance to local police and his extraordinary willingness to be available as a continuing law enforcement resource, 4 longtime Modesto police officers took the unusual step of submitting declarations on Mr. Gratton's behalf, urging the court to release Mr. Gratton at the earliest time possible. Officer Tim Helton of the Modesto Police Department declared, "I am a detective with the Modesto Police Department. I have worked as a peace officer for 16 years and have worked in the Modesto Police Department since July 1986. For 7 years, I have specialized in gang investigation. On October 27, 1999, Sergeant Steve May and I arrested Robert Gratton due to his involvement in 3 small quantity sales of methamphetamine to a confidential informant between August and October 1999. Almost immediately upon his arrest, Mr. Gratton spontaneously volunteered to me that he was a longtime member of the Nuestra Familia criminal organization, that he was looking for a way out of the gang, that he was willing to cooperate with law enforcement, and to tell us everything he knew about not only the Nuestra Familia organization, but about additional local street gangs and specified gang-related activities. Mr. Gratton then began to give me specific names and details about the history and internal structure of the Nuestra Familia organization and about the various crimes the organization had committed in recent years, including the murder of, among others, Robert Brown Bob Viramontes. Based on my discussions with Mr. Gratton on the day of his arrest and again the following day, I determined that the information which he could provide would be of enormous assistance and interest not only to the Modesto Police Department, but also to federal law enforcement authorities. Because of my experience as a gang investigation specialist, I am aware that organized crime activities are considered a high priority item with federal law enforcement agencies such as the Department of Justice and the FBI. I am also aware that the Nuestra Familia organization is considered one of the most ruthless and most established criminal organizations in the state of California. Therefore, shortly after my initial interviews with Mr. Gratton, I contacted Detective George Collard of the Santa Rosa Police Department, who often works closely with the FBI and other federal agencies in the investigation of organized crime activities. Mr. Gratton initially met with Detective Collard on October 29, 1999 at the Stanislaus County Jail. I was also present during this debriefing. Although Mr. Gratton was occasionally hesitant to talk directly To FBI agents during these debriefings, assurances were made to him that cooperation would likely result in a sentence of no more than 1 to 2 years in prison. At the time of these early debriefings, Mr. Gratton was charged only with the state court narcotics trafficking activities for which he was initially arrested. I am aware that Mr. Gratton was eventually charged in federal court and that as a result of these charges, he pled guilty and entered into a cooperation agreement with the government. Since the time of his guilty plea, I have had numerous meetings with Mr. Gratton to discuss the details of literally hundreds of state court crimes which have occurred and are continuing to occur in the Modesto, Turlock, Tracy areas, as well as the surrounding communities. I would conservatively estimate that during the last year or so, I have spent more than 100 hours meeting with Mr. Gratton in person, plus numerous additional hours speaking with him over the telephone. Throughout these meetings, I have always believed Mr. Gratton's information to be truthful, and in most cases, we have been able to independently corroborate his information from other evidence or informants. Because of Mr. Gratton's status in Nuestra Familia during the early and mid-1990s, and because of the notoriety which he achieved by producing the GUN album, he became privy to an astonishing amount of information about criminal activities throughout Stanislaus County and its outskirts. During my meetings and conversations with him, I have been able to obtain extremely detailed and specific information about murders, arson, stabbings, drive-by shootings, large-scale narcotics operations, and numerous other gang-related criminal activities. Many of these crimes had been previously unsolved, and in a great number of instances, prosecution was declined after the victim refused to testify out of fear of reprisal. In each of these instances, Mr. Gratton had expressed his willingness to testify should the government wish him to do so. In all, Mr. Gratton has provided the Modesto police with hundreds of names of criminally active individuals in the Stanislaus County area. Needless to say, it would be extremely time-consuming to set forth an exhaustive list and description of these crimes. However, this declaration is an effort to give this court a flavor of some of the more significant information and intelligence which Mr. Gratton has provided during our many hours of meetings in the last year. It should be emphasized that this information is in addition to the wealth of information which he has provided federal law enforcement authorities about the Nuestra Familia organization and its widespread criminal activities. During our meetings, Mr. Gratton provided me with details about a February 1999 murder which took place at the home of Mr. Gratton's in-laws. Mr. Gratton stated that his daughter had been having a party at the house and an argument had broken out involving individuals named Dale Gutierrez, Juan Padilla, and a third person known to Mr. Gratton as Roger. Mr. Gratton further advised me that Padilla had approached him at the party and told him someone was causing him problems. Padilla had then shown up with a gun, which appeared to Mr. Gratton to be a 9mm handgun. Mr. Gratton reported that as Padilla and his friends were leaving the party, one of them had fired several shots into the crowd, killing one of the persons in attendance. As it turned out, the person killed was actually a friend of those doing the shooting and was not the intended victim. Big old fucking dummy. Mr. Gratton advised me that shortly after this incident took place, Padilla came to him and confessed to his involvement in the shooting. Mr. Gratton also offered to testify at the recently concluded trial of the 3 defendants in which all 3 were found guilty of the offense. Mr. Gratton also told me about an earlier incident involving Juan Padilla, which occurred around 1996. In this incident, Mr. Gratton stated that he had been driving his car and he saw Padilla and a second individual walking down the street with gasoline cans. Believing them to be out of gas, Mr. Gratton stated that he had offered them a ride to their car. Padilla then answered that they were not on their way to a car, but were on their way to burn down a Sureño house on Vine Street. The house was, in fact, burned down later that night. Mr. Gratton stated that in June 1998, he personally witnessed a drive-by shooting which occurred in the areas of Prescott and Jana Streets in Modesto. Mr. Gratton said that he had given a ride to someone named Drew and that without any forewarning, Drew had pulled out a gun and begun shooting into a crowd. As a result of the incident, one person was shot in the heel. Although a report was filed with our department at the time of this incident, see June 27, 1998, police report attached hereto as Exhibit A. No charges have been filed as of now. Should such charges be brought in the future, Mr. Gratton has offered to testify at trial. Although Mr. Gratton did not know the last name of the person involved in the June 27, 1998 shooting, he advised me that this same individual and his brother had been involved in an earlier gang-related shooting in South Modesto, in which two brothers were shot and one was killed. Damn, you fucking telling on your own fucking brother? God damn. Mr. Gratton stated that he had learned of this incident through Abel Payaso Moreno, who told him that the two brothers doing the shooting were his homeboys and had mistaken the two victim brothers for Sureños because they weren't wearing gang colors. Based on this information, I believe the individual involved in the June 1998 drive-by shooting discussed in paragraph 12 to be Drew Orbe. With regard to the earlier double shooting in North Modesto, Mr. Orbe was brought to trial and acquitted after his brother confessed to the shooting while on the witness stand. Mr. Gratton also described a second 1998 incident in which he had been the driver in a drive-by shooting of which he had no forewarning. In this incident, the passenger was Ismo Gonzalez. Gratton stated that Gonzalez had been drinking that day and that as he passed by a Sureño house, Gonzalez pulled out a 9mm handgun and began shooting at the house. The shooting resulted in the killing of a dog and was reported to the Modesto Police Department at the time that it occurred. Damn, man, he killed the fucking dog? It's fucked up, man. See May 16, 1998 police report attached hereto as Exhibit B. Although Mr. Gratton was not aware of this at the time of his interview, I believe that Gonzalez eventually confessed to this incident. Mr. Gratton discussed with me an April 1999 shooting of Frank Loreto by someone named Victor Bazan. Mr. Gratton stated that prior to the shooting, Bazan had come to him and told him that he wanted to get back at someone named Ario, whom he believed had been snitching on fellow Norteños. When Bazan went to carry out the shooting, Loreto attempted to intervene and Bazan shot him with a shotgun. After the shooting took place, Bazan told Mr. Gratton what had happened. Bazan was ultimately charged in connection with the incident prior to Mr. Gratton's cooperation, but pled guilty to a 4-year sentence after Loreto refused to cooperate with investigators. Had we received Mr. Gratton's information prior to this guilty plea, I believe the government's case would have eventually been considerably stronger and a different result may have been achieved. Mr. Gratton provided me with possible information about an unwitnessed October 1999 shooting of Luis Bondi Garcia. Specifically, Mr. Gratton told me that he suspected that Guy Solis may have been the person responsible for the shooting, as it was well known that Solis was sleeping with Bondi's wife. Mr. Gratton also informed me that Solis was a member of the Nuestra Raza, which is a subsidiary of the Nuestra Familia organization. Prior to my meetings with Mr. Gratton, the Modesto police had not heard the rumors about Solis' possible involvement in the shooting, and we were unaware of Solis' membership in the Nuestra Raza. Based on Mr. Gratton's information, I subsequently conducted some follow-up investigation with Solis' parole officer and corroborated that Mr. Gratton had told me. Mr. Gratton told me that Cesar Nino Padilla is the leader of the Norteño organization in Turlock, and that he fatally shot a woman at a party in Merced in 1997 or 1998. During the party, there had been an altercation as Nino was being chased from the scene. He fired a shot into the crowd, killing someone. Mr. Gratton said that after the shooting took place, Nino confessed to him that he had been the responsible party. After receiving this information from Mr. Gratton, I spoke with Detective Larry Parsley of the Merced Sheriff's Department, who confirmed that the shooting had taken place. Detective Parsley advised me that the Merced law enforcement had heard that Nino Padilla might have been the shooter, but did not have sufficient evidence to file charges. Nino was scheduled to be paroled on another criminal matter in May 2001. Prior to that parole date, I intend to get in touch with the Merced County District Attorney in order to advise them of what I learned from Mr. Gratton and to see if this new information will cause them to reconsider their decision not to prosecute. Mr. Gratton was able to provide substantial information about numerous large-scale narcotics traffickers in the Modesto and Turlock areas. Most, if not all, of the names which he provided had already been known to local law enforcement, either from other intelligence sources or due to their past crimes. However, because of our limited resources and manpower, it is obviously impossible for our department to have active and ongoing investigations against all suspected drug dealers and criminals in the city of Modesto. In this respect, Mr. Gratton has been an invaluable assistance in helping us identify the leaders and major players as opposed to the lower level and more minor criminals. As a result of his information, we are now in a much better situation to prioritize who our future targets should be. Mr. Gratton also provided very detailed and specific information about Ricky Boy Martinez's nephew, Domingo Mingo Martinez. In particular, Mr. Gratton stated that Mingo is Ricky Boy's right-hand man and that he and his guys had shot a machine gun at someone's house some time ago. Mr. Gratton stated that he believed we were virtually guaranteed to find drugs, guns, and large amounts of cash in the houses of Mingo, his mother, and his grandmother. As a direct result of Mr. Gratton's information, probation searches were executed on December 13, 2000, and resulted in the seizure of 4 pounds of cocaine, crank, PCP, and marijuana, 3 firearms, and a 1990 Lexus automobile. In addition, Mingo, his mother, and his brother Charles were all arrested during the December 13, 2000 search. Their seizures and arrests would not have happened were it not for the cooperation of Mr. Gratton. Mr. Gratton also corroborated allegations that Manuel Ruelas, the owner of a business called The Perfect Beat, is a major methamphetamine trafficker. Around September of last year, Ruelas was indicted in the United States District Court in Fresno in a case which is still pending. Based upon what Mr. Gratton has told me, I believe he could potentially be called as a witness in Ruelas' case. Mr. Gratton told me about Jojo Ruiz and gave me a list of individuals who are considered with Ruiz, including his customers, partners, and criminal connections. He also told me that of the $48,000 in cash, which was seized from Ruiz's home during a 1999 search warrant, $5,000 was to have been sent to the Nuestra Familia organization. Mr. Gratton also elaborated on an October 1999 incident in which Ruiz was stabbed by Tomas Rup Baharan, a Nuestra Raza member and another close friend of Mr. Gratton. Although our department had been aware of Ruiz's stabbing, the interview with Mr. Gratton was the first I had heard of Baharan's possible involvement in this incident. In addition, Mr. Gratton also helped lend clarity as to the possible motive behind this incident. At the time the stabbing took place, I had heard that Ruiz was stabbed because he had allowed Nuestra Familia money to be lost to the police. However, Mr. Gratton advised me that it was simply a situation in which Baharan felt that he had been disrespected by Ruiz and wanted to put him back in line. Mr. Gratton's cooperation in this matter has even resulted in his implication of close friends and family members. Yeah, man, you've told on the fucking family, boy? That's fucked up, man. No filter. Mr. Gratton told me that his former father-in-law, Primo, and his former son-in-law, Jose, are major narcotics dealers in the Modesto area. Mr. Gratton stated that Primo was dealing large quantities of heroin and methamphetamine and that Jose was a methamphetamine cook. Damn, he took the chemist out, man. Mr. Gratton informed me that Primo had been the one who had supplied him with methamphetamine for 2 of his 3 sales incidents between August and October 1999. Based on this information, both Jose and Primo could be priority targets of our department in the near future. On November 17, 2000, Mr. Gratton gave a 2.5 hour presentation of approximately 30 law enforcement officers who had come from all over Northern California. See report of November 17, 2000 presentation, attached hereto as Exhibit C. I personally arranged for this presentation based on my many hours of discussions with Gratton and my belief that he possessed a tremendous amount of previously unknown information which could be of invaluable interest and assistance to law enforcement throughout the state. Those in attendance at the November 17, 2000 presentation included officials from the United States Drug Enforcement Agency and the California Department of Justice. During the presentation, Mr. Gratton talked about the history of the Nuestra Familia, its organizational structure and hierarchy, the rules and policies which govern the organization, the means and methods which it uses to indoctrinate and recruit new members, and his own personal history and involvement within the gang. In addition, Mr. Gratton also discussed the ways in which the Nuestra Familia uses street gangs, comprised largely of Hispanic teenage boys, to carry out the day-to-day criminal functions of the organization. The presentation was extremely well received by all those who attended, and there was a general consensus among those present that Mr. Gratton could be an extraordinary resource to law enforcement in its future battles against gang activities and gang-related crimes. In fact, shortly after the presentation, I received a telephone call from Dan Puffer of the California Department of Justice advising me that he had discussed Mr. Gratton's presentation with his supervisors and that they were interested in having Mr. Gratton as a guest speaker at the California Attorney General's Conference in 2001. In addition, I also had discussions with several other officers, including Terry Traub of the Watsonville Police Department and Neil Hancock of the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department, who were extremely interested in implementing a tag program in their own counties. I also spoke with Jill Silva, the supervisor of the Juvenile Probation Department in Modesto, who advised me that she would be interested in utilizing Mr. Gratton at future gang awareness and prevention presentations to juvenile probationers. Among the topics which Mr. Gratton discussed during his November 17th presentation was his vision for a gang awareness and education program entitled TAG, an acronym for Teaching About Gangs. As Mr. Gratton envisions it, the TAG program would be a vehicle through which local law enforcement would reach out to at-risk youth, community youth, by holding discussions and forums about the trappings and social pressures which lead impressionable teenagers into the gang lifestyle, and the often disastrous long-term consequences that result from a person's early life decision to become involved with gangs. Because of his own experience with the Nuestra Familia and the mistakes which he made as a youth and a young adult, Mr. Gratton hopes to use the TAG program to impact some of his own experience and hard-learned lessons to young people in the hopes that they may avoid the same mistakes which he has made. Even before the November 17th presentation, I had discussed the TAG program with Mr. Gratton at length, and I believe that the idea is one which could make a significant difference in the fight against gangs. Go Gratton. Get them fucking gangs. Yeah, right. I also believe that Mr. Gratton is sincere in his desire to atone for the mistakes of his youth, and that he is in an excellent position to make a very real impact upon kids. Because of Mr. Gratton's own gang background, and most of all, because of the status he attained with his production of the extremely popular GUN album, Mr. Gratton would not only hold immediate credibility with kids, but would also be in a position to establish a quick and meaningful rapport with them. Furthermore, I believe that the TAG program's anti-gang and anti-violence message would hold great weight when coming from an individual such as Mr. Gratton, who has personally lived through the very lifestyle which he now hopes to turn kids away from. As a result of my many years of experience as a gang investigation specialist, I am aware that Nuestra Familia has an explicit policy of death for any member who even drops out of the organization, let alone those who drop out and become snitches. Fucking snitches. I am also aware of specific instances in which Nuestra Familia has threatened retaliation against disloyal members of the organization by injuring or even killing wives, girlfriends, and or children of the individual. Because of my knowledge of these Nuestra Familia policies and of the organization's demonstrated past ability to carry out these policies, I have had serious concerns throughout this investigation about the safety of Mr. Gratton and his loved ones. During the early stages of Mr. Gratton's cooperation and before his case was charged federally, I personally moved him from county jail to county jail in order to ensure his continued safety. In addition, I also took responsibility for ensuring the security of Mr. Gratton's common law wife, Angelica Lopez, as well as the couple's 19-month-old son and Angelica's 5-year-old son from a prior relationship. Beginning in October 1999, I moved Angelica and her 2 sons to various motels in Turlock, Modesto, and Sonora so that their whereabouts would continue to be unknown to Nuestra Familia and anyone associated with the organization and its subordinate criminal organizations. The safety of Mr. Gratton's family is currently in the hands of the United States Marshals. Despite law enforcement's best efforts to protect Mr. Gratton, his mysterious disappearance and ongoing absence from both the streets and the state prisons make it only too easy for his former associates to deduce that he is now a cooperating government witness. I personally know of questions on the streets about Mr. Gratton's current whereabouts, and I have also heard the common rumors that Mr. Gratton has become a snitch. Dirty fucking snitch. I am also aware of a recent incident in which an official from the California Department of Corrections was pressed for information about Mr. Gratton's status. When the CDC officer declined to answer these inquiries, the other individual stated that he had heard Mr. Gratton was now working for the government. In short, it would be difficult to overstate the value of the information which Mr. Gratton has provided to local law enforcement during his cooperation in this matter. Moreover, I believe it is telling that while Mr. Gratton's plea agreement only obligates him with regard to the prosecution of past and ongoing gang-related crimes, Mr. Gratton has actually gone far beyond these obligations by implementing plans for a program that would also prevent future generations of youth from falling into the spiraling cycle of gangs, crimes, violence, and imprisonment. In recognition of Mr. Gratton's enormous assistance to law enforcement, the grave and permanent danger to which he has exposed both himself and his loved ones, and his strong commitment to making amends to society, it is my personal desire to see him released from prison at the earliest time possible. From the standpoint of law enforcement, Mr. Gratton is a valuable resource whose talents, experience, and knowledge can best be put to use only if he is free of the constraints that are imposed by being in a prison facility. Sergeant Steve May of the Modesto Police Department declared, I am a sergeant with the Modesto Police Department. I have worked as a peace officer for approximately 25 years, and I have spent the last 22 of those years with the Modesto Police Department. I am the supervisor for the detective Tim Helton, who has overseen much of the investigation and questioning since Mr. Gratton began cooperating in this matter. I was also with Detective Helton when we initially arrested Mr. Gratton on October 27, 1999. After his arrest, Mr. Gratton's decision to cooperate was almost instantaneous. Even as we drove back to the station, he began to talk freely, voluntarily, and opening up about the Nuestra Familia and about his own history of involvement within the organization. Mr. Gratton advised us that he wanted out of the gang, that he was afraid for his life if he were sent to jail, and that he would literally do nothing the government asked of him. On November 17, 2000, I attended a presentation which Mr. Gratton gave to law enforcement officers concerning the Nuestra Familia organization and other related gangs and gang activities. During this presentation, Mr. Gratton also spoke of his plans to implement a gang prevention, education, and awareness program called TAG, teaching about gangs. In all, I was extremely impressed with the breadth of Mr. Gratton's knowledge and experience, not to mention his upfront candor and his apparent willingness to give something back to society in atonement for his past mistakes. I believe Mr. Gratton has the ability and knowledge to be of tremendous value, both as a future speaker at law enforcement training seminars and as a lecturer and contributor at youth education programs and forums. Based on my dealings with Mr. Gratton, I believe him to be as committed to changing as a person with his background and circumstances can be. Furthermore, by so fully and thoroughly cooperating in this matter, Mr. Gratton has made an irreversible decision to get out of the game forever. Having made this decision, Mr. Gratton has left himself with no alternative other than becoming a law-abiding and productive member of society. Based on my many years of experience investigating gangs, I know with certainty that if Mr. Gratton were ever to try returning to his former life, he would be immediately killed for his past activities as a snitch. Dirty fucking snitch. For the same reason, Mr. Gratton would also be placing himself in imminent and severe danger if he were ever to commit any crimes that would result in a state prison sentence. For all of these reasons, I would like to see Mr. Gratton released in the near future so that his experience and knowledge may be fully utilized by law enforcement in its continuing battle against street gangs and organized crime. Provided that he obeys the law, abides by whatever probation conditions the court imposes, and continues to fulfill his commitments under the cooperation agreement, I personally would like to see Mr. Gratton released at the time of sentencing, with credit for time served. God damn. Detective George Stowe of the Modesto Police Department declared, I am a detective with the Investigative Services Division of the Modesto Police Department. I have worked as a peace officer for approximately 20 years, and I have spent the last 13 of those years with the Modesto Police Department. As a detective in the Investigative Services Division, I specialize in the investigation of Hispanic gangs such as Nuestra Familia and its subsidiary organizations, which consist of Nuestra and the various Norteño street gangs. On October 27, 1999, Mr. Gratton was arrested by Detective Tim Helton and Sergeant Steve May of the Modesto Police Department. After Mr. Gratton's arrest, I was advised that during the ride over to the station, he had spontaneously volunteered to cooperate with the government and had then begun sharing information about his involvement in the Nuestra Familia criminal organization. Based on this initial information which Mr. Gratton had provided, I was asked to step in and conduct a more extensive interview with him. At the outset of our meeting, Mr. Gratton waived his Miranda rights and agreed to let me interview him without the presence of an attorney. During the ensuing interview, Mr. Gratton spoke freely and candidly about his involvement in Nuestra Familia and about various crimes for which the organization had been responsible over the years. In addition, Mr. Gratton also gave me the names of several local large-scale narcotics dealers, and he provided me information about many of Modesto's local street gangs, including the names of individuals who were actively involved in each of those gangs. Towards the end of the interview, Mr. Gratton allowed me to take pictures of his various tattoos, and he explained to me the meaning and significance of many of these tattoos. During the course of the interview, Mr. Gratton stated that he had grown tired of being in the gang and was looking for a way out, once and for all. He advised me that he wished to cooperate fully with law enforcement, that he was willing to testify in as many cases and as many times as necessary, and that he was even willing to assist in making controlled buys of narcotics from local dealers. Damn, boy. Since the time of Mr. Gratton's initial arrest, I have been present and assisted in several interviews of Mr. Gratton, including a videotaped debriefing at the Stanislaus County Safety Center and an audio-taped interview conducted by Detective Tim Helton and me at the Federal Detention Center in Dublin. During this latter interview, Mr. Gratton discussed his knowledge concerning several drive-by and gang-related shootings, including two to which he was a percipient eyewitness. As a longtime police officer and a specialist in Hispanic gang activities, I can attest that it has truly been the opportunity of a career to be able to have these meetings and discussions with someone such as Mr. Gratton, who is not only a high-ranking member of the Nuestra Familia, but who was privy to a mind-boggling amount of information about not only the organization, but also about local street gangs and their members. Because of Nuestra Familia's established track record of violence against disloyal members and their families, it is an extremely rare occurrence for a member of the organization to cooperate with law enforcement and to candidly answer questions about his membership in the organization. It is an even rarer occurrence when the cooperating individual is not merely a member, but a high-ranking member such as Mr. Gratton. Well, you got these motherfucking cops fooled, boy. Furthermore, Mr. Gratton has not only agreed to cooperate and answer questions, but has literally agreed to do everything which the government asks of him, including testifying in as many cases as necessary and actively working with local law enforcement to help bring an end to the Nuestra Familia organization and all of its subsidiary criminal organizations. In my 20-year career, Mr. Gratton is the first high-ranking member of the Nuestra Familia organization who has ever agreed to cooperate and speak with me in this manner. And my meetings and discussions with him have truly provided a window into the organization that few gang experts will ever be fortunate enough to experience. Furthermore, in agreeing to cooperate as fully and as extensively as he has, Mr. Gratton understands that he has placed both himself and his family in grave personal danger from which they will never again be free. I have heard rumors on the streets concerning Mr. Gratton's current status as a snitch. Dirty fucking snitch. And I am aware that his status is no longer a secret among street gang members in the Modesto area. In fact, towards the beginning of this case, I personally helped move Mr. Gratton's wife, Angelica, from motel to motel in order to ensure her safety. During my meetings with Mr. Gratton, he has discussed with me his plans for implementing a gang prevention and awareness program entitled TAG, Teaching About Gangs. I personally endorse Mr. Gratton's plans for the TAG program, and I would be eager to work with him on launching this program once he is released from custody. I believe that Mr. Gratton has an enormous potential to make an impact on at-risk teenage youth by speaking at high schools and at citizen groups and workshops. Because of the value that I believe Mr. Gratton would bring to these types of forums, the Modesto Police Department would of course make all the necessary arrangements to provide for his security at such events. As a police officer and gang specialist, I believe that Mr. Gratton is in a position to make an enormous difference in the fight against gangs and organized crime. You go, Mr. Gratton. I also believe that he is sincere in his desire to change and help future generations of youth avoid his own past mistakes. Based on what he has already done, what he has undertaken to do in the future, and what he has put himself and his family through as a result of his decision to cooperate, I believe that it would be appropriate for the court to release Mr. Gratton at the time of sentencing so that his skills and talents can be put to immediate and better use by law enforcement. Detective Al Broschini of the Modesto Police Department declared, "I am a homicide detective with the Modesto Police Department. I have worked as a peace officer for 16 years and have worked in the Modesto Police Department since 1993. In my capacity as a police detective, I headed up the investigation into the February 1999 gang-related murder which took place at the home of Mr. Gratton's in-laws. As part of my investigation, I conducted 3 separate interviews with Mr. Gratton. During these interviews, Mr. Gratton was very cooperative and told me everything he knew about the incident, as set forth in the declaration of my colleague, Detective Tim Helton, including the fact that Juan Padilla had confessed to him about his involvement in the shooting after it occurred. Mr. Gratton also advised me that he was willing to testify at the recently concluded trial on this matter, and I believe he would have made an excellent government witness had the prosecutor chosen to call him. Based on my dealings with Mr. Gratton, I believe that he is truly motivated to change for the better. Unlike most cooperating witnesses who provide only the information which they are asked about, Mr. Gratton has shown a willingness to go well beyond just answering the questions posed to him by volunteering information and by to affirmatively assist in educating law enforcement about gang activities and organized crime. Given the extreme danger in which he has placed himself and his family, I do not believe that Mr. Gratton would have made such extraordinary efforts if he did not have a true desire to change. Hook, line, and sinker. I am not only assigned as a homicide detective, I am also one of the Modesto Police Department's experts on criminal street gangs. I regularly testify in court on the benefits that a criminal street gang or gang member receives for committing crimes. Mr. Gratton has supplied crucial information on street gangs and prison gangs that I have relied upon in coming to my expert opinion. If I have a question regarding criminal street gangs, I am confident that Mr. Gratton will remain available and accessible as a resource to our department and to other law enforcement agencies throughout Northern California. Based on the foregoing and the fact that Mr. Gratton has done everything asked of him by law enforcement, I would request that Mr. Gratton receive favorable consideration from the court at the time of his sentencing. Moreover, Officer Tim Helton, with whom Gratton had worked closely since his October 27, 1990 arrest, also drafted a letter to the court dated February 5th, 2001. Fuck, are you serious, man? Personally urging the court to consider the extraordinary circumstances of Gratton's case and to release him with credit for time served. Officer Helton's letter stated, now did this dude really have to put this fucking letter in the book? And he must really had nothing else to talk about. Otherwise, he could have just said, yeah, fucking cop wrote a letter on his behalf, a positive letter. But I guess anything to fill the pages, right? Anyway, Officer Helton's letter stated, Your Honor, thank you in advance for taking time out to read my letter regarding Robert Gratton. This is an unusual situation. I spent over a year investigating Mr. Gratton's activities to incarcerate him, and now I find myself writing the court in consideration of a lesser sentence for his cooperation. However, I feel it's appropriate that due consideration be given to Mr. Gratton for the information, insight, and assistance he has provided. I can't emphasize how unusual it is to find someone with Mr. Gratton's background cooperating with law enforcement. The Nuestra Familia, the prison street gang that Mr. Gratton was a member of, promotes to its members that should they cooperate with law enforcement, they will be sought out and killed, or their loved ones killed in their absence for cooperating with the police. Additionally, the Nuestra Familia informs its members through their training that law enforcement will not protect them and will only utilize the information they offer and abandon them. I see this as an opportunity to squash this negative atmosphere created by the Nuestra Familia and offer that there is yet another way out. Gang members have often told me that they felt there was no way out, no escape. Mr. Gratton has offered information regarding the activities of the Nuestra Familia regarding their activities, conspiracies to commit homicides, felony assaults, and drug sales. The information offered is too extensive to outline in this letter and would be a duplication of effort as the FBI and the probation report should outline the details of Mr. Gratton's cooperation. At the street level, the information and insight has proved very valuable. Mr. Gratton has identified members and their importance within the Nuestra Familia that would not have been known without his cooperation. In just one instance, Mr. Gratton assisted me in identifying over 40 persons involved in the sales of base cocaine in West Modesto. This organization is responsible for the majority of the base cocaine, rock cocaine in Modesto. I have utilized the information Mr. Gratton has given me in several instances which led to felony arrest. One of the most recent was a local Norteño gang member who was involved in the sales of controlled substances. Incident to a search of the suspect's house, Domingo Martinez and Charles Martinez, we recovered 4 handguns and over 4 pounds of drugs, which included marijuana, PCP, methamphetamine, and cocaine. The suspects were fortifying this residence by placing Kevlar within walls they were constructing. This was in addition to a cement wall at the entry with an electronic door release and surveillance camera. This residence posed a danger not only to law enforcement, but also the surrounding neighborhood. Early in the investigation and at the inception of Mr. Gratton's cooperation, promises of protection and consideration for his assistance and testimony were made, possibly prematurely, but nonetheless made. The suggestions were that he might have to spend a year in prison. He and his family would be relocated and protected. During the past 17 months, Mr. Gratton has never wavered. He has remained committed to cooperating, as has his family. Certainly, his options are minimal, but nonetheless, his cooperation has been outstanding. Even though he has had to endure being in protective custody and not had the same privileges extended to other inmates. I have offered the analogy that he has done his time in a broom closet because of his isolation. Mr. Gratton spoke to a group of investigators and probation officers in November while working with me. He was very well received. There have been several inquiries since regarding his availability to teach and his gang suppression program TAG that he has authored since being in custody. California Department of Justice Criminal Dan Puffer called to ask if Mr. Gratton would be available this next year to speak at the Attorney General's workshop in regard to organized crime. I believe it would be appropriate to release Mr. Gratton from custody with the following stipulations: extensive supervision, community service, and a 5-year parole. During the parole, Mr. Gratton would be required to complete his community service. These are truly uncharted waters. Mr. Gratton being available to assist law enforcement would be a great asset. His knowledge and influence with youth gang members offers a unique perspective in which to approach at-risk youth. Along with a few other letters from Gratton's family, Judge Chesney considered the following, which was taken from a federal court document. Motherfucker. Had Mr. Gratton's case remained in state court, his conviction on the 3 small hand-to-hand drug sales would likely have resulted in a sentence of approximately 6 to 8 years in state prison. See Declaration of Greg Spears. Under California law, a defendant is eligible for 6 months of work time credit for every 6-month period of full-time performance in a prison work, vocational, or educational program. California PC 2933A. Thus, if Mr. Gratton's case had stayed in state court, he could reasonably have been expected to spend only 3 to 4 years in actual custody. After giving a brief verbal outline regarding her reasoning, Judge Chesney committed Robert Lee Gratton to the custody of the United States Bureau of Prisons for a term of 26 months. Stung his ass. He was then transferred to an undisclosed federal prison to finish his term. Gratton had gotten a sweet deal, and the only thing left for him to do was to wait it out and see what the government did with the information he had provided.